At 4 a.m. on the morning of October 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea was a dark, restless mirror reflecting the most desperate gamble of the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur had fulfilled his promise. He had returned to the Philippines, landing his massive invasion force on the shores of Leyte. But while the soldiers on the beach looked inland, a catastrophe was brewing behind them on the horizon. Admiral William Bull Halsey, the commander of the mighty American Third Fleet, had been lured away by a brilliant Japanese deception. He had taken his fast battleships and heavy aircraft carriers north, chasing a decoy force of empty Japanese carriers, believing he had neutralized the main threat. In doing so, he had left the back door to the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. The only force standing between the vulnerable American invasion fleet and total annihilation was a small, unarmored task unit known by the calcine Taffy. 3. This unit, led by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, was never designed for a surface engagement. It consisted of 6 slow, thin-skinned escort carriers, nicknamed Jeep carriers or Kaiser coffins because they were built on merchant ship hulls. They were slow, top EV, and carried almost no armor. Protecting these carriers were the small boys, 3 Fletcher-Class destroyers, and 4 tiny destroyer escorts. These ships were the tin cans of the United States Navy. Their hulls were just 3/8 of an inch of special treatment steel, barely enough to keep the ocean out, and certainly not enough to stop a naval shell. Among these small defenders sat the USS Johnston, tail number DD 557. Standing on her bridge was a man whose spirit was as jagged as the coastline of his Native American ancestors. Commander Ernest Evans was 35 years old, a man of Cherokee and Creek heritage who had fought his way through the racial barriers of the time to graduate from the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Evans didn't just command a ship, he inhabited it. He was a man of cold, calculated violence when it came to warfare. When the Johnston had been commissioned in Seattle a year earlier, Evans had stood before his crew and issued a warning that would become the ship's epitaph. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. His men stayed. They knew Evans was a sailor's captain, but they didn't yet realize that harm's way was an understatement for what was coming. At 6:30 a.m., the morning mist began to lift, revealing a sea that looked peaceful. Taffy 3 was performing its routine duty, launching anti-submarine patrols and providing air support for the troops on Leyte. But at 6:43 a.m., the peaceful routine was shattered. In the Johnston's radar room, Lieutenant Junior Grade Jack Beckel watched a series of massive blips materialize on his scope from the northwest. Range 20 miles and closing fast, he reported. At first, Admiral Sprague thought it might be Halsey's fleet returning. But as the lookouts trained their long-range optics toward the horizon, the terrifying truth became clear. Emerging from the haze were the unmistakable pagoda-style masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. It was a forest of steel. Admiral Takeo Krita had brought the most powerful surface fleet left in the world to the doorstep of Leyte Gulf. Leading the column was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, a 72,000-ton monster carrying 9 18-inch guns. A single shell from the Yamato weighed 3,200 pounds, roughly the size of a modern Carond, could travel 25 miles with enough kinetic energy to vaporize a destroyer. Behind her were the battleships Nagato, Kongu, and Haruna, accompanied by 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers. The mismatch was not just extreme, it was comical. It was a pack of wolves entering a nursery. Standard naval doctrine was crystal clear. Taffy 3 should turn east, launch its planes, and run for its life while laying smoke. But Commander Ernest Evans was not a man who followed the doctrine of retreat. He saw the carriers behind him and knew that if the Japanese reached them, thousands of American sailors would be slaughtered in the water. Without waiting for a signal from Admiral Sprague, without a single ship to support his flank, Evans looked at his helmsman and gave the order that would change naval history forever. All engines ahead, flank. Prepare for torpedo attack. We are going in. To truly appreciate the insanity of Part 2, one must understand the mechanical soul of the USS Johnston. The Fletcher-Class destroyer was the backbone of the US Navy's surface fleet, a versatile, high-speed platform designed for versatility, not durability. Powered by 2 General Electric geared steam turbines, and for Babcock and Wilcox boilers, the Johnston could generate 60,000 shaft horsepower. This allowed her to reach a top speed of 36.5 knots, making her one of the fastest objects on the ocean. She was built for speed because speed was her only defense. Her hull was so thin that a 14-inch battleship shell would likely pass clean through both sides of the ship without even detonating, a phenomenon known as overpenetration. While this sometimes saved ships from exploding, it meant the crew was essentially fighting inside a tin whistle. The Johnston's main armament consisted of 5 5-inch, 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. These guns were masterpieces of mechanical engineering, capable of a blistering rate of fire up to 15 rounds per minute per gun. They were controlled by the Mark 37 fire control system, an early electromechanical computer that could calculate lead, windage, and roll to place a shell with pinpoint accuracy. However, a 5-inch shell weighed only 54 pounds. To the Yamato, whose armor belt was 16 inches of Krupp-cemented steel, these shells were nothing more than annoying sparks. The Johnston's only real capital weapons were her 10-21-inch mark. 15 torpedoes. These were the primary tools of the destroyer's trade. Each torpedo carried a 490-pound warhead of Torpix, a highly stable and incredibly powerful explosive. To launch them, the Johnston had to be within 10,000 yards of the target. This was the suicide zone, as it required the ship to sail well, within the range of the enemy's secondary batteries and even their main guns. Now, consider the opposition. The Yamato was a fortress on the water. Her 18.1-inch guns used a complex, triple-lens optical rangefinder that stood 50 feet wide. When those guns fired, the pressure was so immense that any crew member on deck without protection would have their eardrums ruptured instantly. The Japanese center force was a collection of the finest naval engineering the Empire had to offer, and they were manned by veteran crews who had survived years of brutal combat. As the Johnston accelerated to 36 knots, black, oily smoke began to pour from her funnels. Evans ordered his chemical smoke generators turned on, creating a thick, white chemical fog that drifted across the surface of the water. He was using the Johnston as a giant ink sac, trying to hide the carriers behind a wall of artificial cloud. The ship began to vibrate as the turbines reached their maximum output. Below decks, the snipes, the engineers, and firemen were working in 120-degree heat, feeding the boilers and monitoring the steam pressure gauges with frantic intensity. They knew they were charging into a meat grinder, but the rhythm of the engines gave them a sense of purpose. On the Japanese bridge of the heavy cruiser Kumano, Admiral Kurita was watching the American horizon through his rangefinders. He was baffled. He had expected Taffy 3 to be a part of Halsey's main fleet, but his lookouts reported only small escort carriers. When he saw a single destroyer emerge from the smoke and begin the high-spur charge, directly toward his line, he was stunned. He assumed the Americans must have a massive force hidden behind the smoke. He didn't realize he was looking at a single commander who simply refused to die. At 7:10 a.m., the distance between the Johnston and the Japanese line had closed to 18,000. Yaz Evans leaned over the bridge and looked at his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen. "Open fire," he commanded. The Johnston's 5 turrets let out a synchronized roar. Because of the Mark 37 computer, the Johnston's fire was incredibly accurate. Shell after shell began to rain down on the Kumano, the lead heavy cruiser. They weren't sinking the ship, but they were wreaking havoc on her decks. They were shredding radio antennas, smashing searchlights, and killing the exposed gun crews on the anti-aircraft mounts. The Japanese cruisers responded with a thunderous volley of 8-inch fire. Massive columns of water erupted around the Johnston, dyed bright red and green by the Japanese spotting dyes. Each dye color corresponded to a different ship, allowing the Japanese gunners to see which splashes belonged to their guns. Evans stood on the bridge wing, watching the colored geysers. He gave a famous order to the helmsman: "Chase the splashes." He knew that the Japanese gunners would correct their aim based on where the last shell landed, by steering the ship directly into the spot where the water was still falling. Evans was betting that the next salvo would land somewhere else. It was a high-speed dance with death. The Johnston was weaving through a forest of water and steel, her 5-inch guns never stopping their rhythmic bark. Hagen later recalled that the ship felt like a living thing, straining against the water as it closed the distance. The 10,000-yard mark was approaching, the moment where Part 2 ends and the legendary torpedo run begins.